The ancient school of salvation by hidden knowledge known to us as Gnosticism has come to truly inspire people since the discovery of the lost scriptures of the Nag Hammadi library in 1945. In those forgotten codices were esoteric Christian teachings which shocked both the ancient and modern worlds. And core to many of those texts was the conception that the cosmos, the physical world that we live in, was created not by a benevolent deity, but by an ignorant, sadistic, satanic figure as a kind of prison made of matter in which to trap the spiritual dimension, the true dimension of all human beings. This demiurge, or craftsman, was known variously as Samael, Saklas, and Yaldabaoth, a grim abortion of some texts have it, a hideous amalgamation, fearsome and horrible in its existence. And this concept was just as shocking to the ancient world as it is to our own. The philosopher Plotinus composed a lengthy rebuttal to what he took to be a corruption of the properly philosophical Platonic myth of the creation of the cosmos. But this profoundly pessimistic view of the cosmos and its creation is only one voice among the Gnostics. Indeed, what seems to have been one of the more popular, if not the most popular Gnostic school, that of the teachings of Valentinus, seems to have taught a far less dualistic theory of the demiurge, one in which the crafter of the cosmos, while ignorant to higher spiritual reality, plays a decisive role in salvation history itself, even achieving a kind of Gnostic salvation for the demiurge. As part of my ongoing series on the concept of the Gnostic demiurge, let's explore the concept as it appears in Valentinian Gnosticism. Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica for weekly explorations on topics in esoteric history, and if you'd like to support the work of providing accessible, evidence-backed, and free content on topics in esoteric matters, I'd hope you consider taking a look at my Patreon, or maybe consider picking up some of the cool merch you can find over at the channel. If you're new to the study of esotericism and you want to get a lay of the land, make sure to check out my study guide, which will orient you to the literature more generally. And if you're interested in actual antiquarian historical books on topics of the occult, the esoteric, and the mystical, check out my bookstore, Esoterica Rare Books. You can find all those links in the description and in the pinned comment below. But now, let's turn to the Valentinian conception of the demiurge and its role in the Gnostic theory of salvation. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. As I mentioned in the introduction, this episode is actually part 4 in a series exploring what is perhaps the most shocking philosophical and theological conception of the ancient world, that the cosmos is a prison made of matter created by a horrible demonic entity known as the demiurge. Now, in previous episodes, I've explored how this idea developed around the turn of the Common Era. But in very brief summary, the previous few episodes introduced us to the concept of the demiurge as it first developed in Plato's text, the Timaeus, leading to the creation of an imperfect, though certainly not evil world, along with Judean Egyptian religious polemics that led to the association of the Israelite god Yahweh with the Egyptian deity of chaos and foreigners, the deity known as Set. The rising Jesus movement would see the theological conflict with the emergent rabbinical establishment, leading to and by the composition of texts like the Gospel of John around 100 of the Common Era. This led to a nascent theological position whereby the father of Jesus was not identical to the father of the Judeans, or the Jews, who were associated with either the devil or the father of the devil, depending on how you read that complicated text in John 8. Now, to be clear, I cover all of that stuff in previous episodes, but this episode stands on its own if you just want to learn about the Valentinian conception of the demiurge. But further on, as Christianity reached majority non-Jewish populations, the connection with the Torah and the value of the theological narratives of the Hebrew Bible, or the Christian Old Testament, would become weakened among those non-Jewish Christian converts. So much so that early Christian theologians like Marcion would conclude that the creator of the Hebrew Bible was, in fact, not a god at all, but a tyrant of mysterious origins, who sort of becomes an angel later, with the Father of Christ being the authentic deity, Christ having been sent to, in fact, deliver us from the evil creator. Indeed, Marcion would be perhaps the first true figure to produce something like a Christian canon or New Testament of scriptures and work out a coherent theory of salvation history. Now, of course, his position was ultimately rejected by the Proto-Catholic Church, and despite there being Marcionite churches surviving for centuries after his death, his movement would ultimately go down, at least in official church history, as a Titanic heresy. But this isn't a dogmatic channel, and so terms like heresy really don't mean much here. You don't have much power here, church. At the same time, early Christian theologians like Simon the Samaritan were developing a theology informed by Stoic, Neo-Pythagorean, and Greek medical speculation, largely taking the form of an esoteric interpretation of the creation story found in the book of Genesis. Specifically, the creation of the primal human being found there in Genesis. Here, a distant creator would generate a kind of divine feminine thought or wisdom. This divine female form of thought or wisdom was conceived as creating the host of angels, who would in turn create the physical cosmos along with this primordial human being. But the angels, not wishing to lose their thought mother, actually rebel and entrap her in physical bodies, in our bodies. And in that, the divine fire, the primordial God, gave rise to a primal mind, and that we are made in the image of that thought, wisdom, feminine, divine being. We are thus able to connect to the divine precisely through the salvific power of our knowing. That act of knowing that we are ultimately regions of the divine is thus a kind of theurgy or theosis, a kind of becoming divine, as salvation itself, something quite similar, in fact, to Hermeticism. Around that same time, perhaps over in Antioch in the early 2nd century, emerged the mysterious Sethian teacher, named for their priority theologically and spiritually of the third son of Adam. And it would be the Sethian teacher that would develop the theology most associated with Gnosticism, that is to say, the lion-faced Demiurge, Yaldabaoth, generated by Sophia in an illicit act of creation. This ignorant, demonic entity will go on to create the physical cosmos, along with its rulers, the horrible prison wardens, the archons, and they would generate all this as a kind of prison for the spiritual being of the human being. The coming of Christ in this teaching was a revelation about the true spiritual nature of human beings, and thus how to escape from this prison of clay and cosmos and how to do all of that. And it would be the scandalous variant of Gnosticism that came under attack by both pagans and proto-Catholics alike, equally earning the ire of people like Plotinus and Irenaeus. But, again, all of this is just a very brief summary of the first 3 episodes of this series on the Demiurge, and if you want a fuller understanding of how all of these ideas developed, I would really recommend you checking out the series, along with my episode on the Apocryphon of John, the text that most specifically details this variant of the Gnostic myth, this whole Yaldabaoth stuff. But again, this episode does stand on its own as well. However, perhaps precisely because of this rather extreme position taken by the Sethian teacher, this variant of Gnostic theology has become identified with Gnosticism as such. It's just become what people think of when they think about Gnosticism. Thus, when most people describe Gnosticism, they often just metonymize a schematic version of the Apocryphon of John as representing Gnosticism more generally. But this frankly feeds into a long-standing problem in the field, the conception of Gnosticism as a unified singular theology or theory for the origins of evil and salvation. Simply put, what goes under the term Gnosticism is honestly a pretty heterogeneous, sometimes even mutually exclusive group of beliefs, mythologies, and theories of salvation. Again, this is all detailed in Michael Williams' fantastic book, where he pretty seriously problematizes this category. It's what I would call a low-resolution category. Yeah, it's useful up to a point, but it's almost immediately in need of a higher resolution theory when any substantial analysis has to be performed. Categories like Gnosticism can be useful, but they're never true. The map just isn't the territory, and we should be prepared to dispense with such categories when they're no longer helpful, which is pretty quick when you're dealing with the term Gnosticism, and this is actually just such an instance. The concept of the Demiurge apparently varied quite a bit among Christian sects, ranging from the Christ Logos as creator to the malevolent Demiurge of the Sethian teacher. But among the so-called Gnostics, it's worth pointing out that perhaps the most popular, the 2nd century Christian teacher Valentinus, perhaps again the most popular of these Gnostics, held a position on the Demiurge marked by profound intellectual subtlety. Indeed, it seems that the school of Valentinus taught that the concept of the malevolent Demiurge, as detailed by someone like the Sethian teacher, was, quote, completely in error, and that only, quote, thoughtless people have this idea, as it's stated at least in the letter to Flora. Thus, this may very well upend both proto-Catholic, ancient pagan, and even contemporary stereotypes about what the Gnostics believed. This whole evil creator stuff, it might not be essentially Gnostic, and it's certainly not an idea to be found in Valentinianism, which might have been one of the most popular forms of Gnosticism in history. Now, I've done a whole episode on the Valentinian variant of Gnostic Christianity, an appellation, frankly, I'm not totally comfortable with, to be honest. Valentinus and his movement would have just understood themselves to be Christians, but his theology was marked by a complex system of emanations and pairs, or syzygies, from an otherwise deeper primordial deity. Valentinus himself was apparently popular enough to nearly become the Bishop of Rome, a position that wasn't exactly papal in any strong sense, but it wasn't nothing, at least in the 2nd century, and it seems like he had a pretty substantial following, and he prepared theological texts, probably including the Gospel of Truth, which is preserved in the Nag Hammadi library, and even a recently realized text, a text called On Self-Control, such that his movement persisted for centuries after his death in both Eastern and Western variants. Thus, it would be reasonable to conclude that while the Sethian variant has become identified with Gnosticism generally, it was the Valentinians that were perhaps among the more popular, if not the most popular, of the Gnostic Christianities. And thus, getting at his conception of the Demiurge might actually give us a better window into what the Gnostics believed, or at least that form of Christianity. But as with all Christian sects, there must be a narrative to interject evil into the development of the cosmos. Otherwise, you really don't need a Christ character to, come along and fix it. Both the Valentinians and the Sethians seem to primarily locate this fall not only in the Garden of Eden narrative, but in the metaphysical production of the cosmos itself, specifically in the fall of wisdom, divinely personified as Sophia. For the Valentinians, this emerges from a primordial buthos, or divine profundity and silence, which again emerge divine archetypal pairs, which generate further entities, finally resulting in theletos, or the longed-for one, along with Sophia, or wisdom. Sophia, however, has an intense but somehow inappropriate, passionate curiosity to know the primordial profundity of the Father, and this passion causes her to be rent asunder. A higher Sophia remains dwelling up into the realm of the divine fullness, or the pleroma, while a lower Sophia, known as Achamot, is cast out into, outside the pleroma. Achamot is apparently just the Hebrew word chokhmah, or wisdom, and a good bit of the remaining drama of the Valentinian mythology will focus on her and the creation of the world via the Demiurge. Expelled from the pleroma, Achamot's sense of lack and anguish congeal into the left to become Hule, or the matter out of which the cosmos will be formed, along with Satan and his minions, but more on that in a moment. But she also repents of her inappropriate desires, and this act of contrition becomes right, or psyche, soul, or mind. Eventually, the primordial Father takes pity on her and sends Christ to both comfort her, but also to teach her gnosis of the Father, the true knowledge of the Father, which she was always wanting to begin with. Why he couldn't have just done that The start is not clear, but at any rate, this gnosis becomes spirit. Thus, the fundamental substances of the cosmos have all come into being. Matter, which is incapable of salvation, the free will of suke or soul, which can choose salvation, and spirit, that which is saved through gnosis. These are the what of salvation, but the how of salvation is directly tied to the Demiurge. Indeed, the Valentinian Demiurge is a crucial, even necessary part of the process of salvation itself. While the spiritual seed has come into being, it remains a kind of abstraction. It lacks a concrete form necessary for salvation, a somethingness which can undergo the salvific process. To provide that concrete form, Sophia Achamout emits an entity from soul in the form of the primordial Father. Now, this primordial psychic form of the Father is a pale or coarse imitation of the primordial Father between the spiritual seed and the gross matter of the left. This entity, this emanation from Sophia, this is the Demiurge. In profound contrast to the demonic Sethian Demiurge, here we're told that insofar as the Demiurge is made in the form of the supernal Father and will come to shape the cosmos from matter, that this entity can be rightly called king or father and even God in a specifically restricted sense of those terms. But given its lower psychic form rather than the higher spiritual form, the Demiurge is ignorant of the higher spiritual reality of the pleroma and thus of its own origins, declaring, I am God alone, there is none else. It's ignorant of that spiritual reality and acts, at least at first, merely as, quote, a hand to beautify and labor upon the things below, as a kind of robot driven by Sophia and thus the cunning of wisdom. And driven by this cunning, the Demiurge and his angelic companions set out creating the material cosmos, combining both psychical and material substances, combining the right and the left over from the ancient emotions of Sophia Achamout, and finally ruling over the cosmos from the eighth heaven, thus making creation a kind of inverse pleroma with Sophia and the Demiurge at the center of sort of two inverted triangles. Here the Valentinian system is much closer to the Timaeus of Plato than the myth of the Sethian teacher. Recall that the Platonic Demiurge attempted to impress the perfect forms into imperfect matter, thus creating an imperfect cosmos out of necessity. Imperfect, but also the best possible cosmos given the imperfection of matter. That's utterly unlike the Sethian teacher, for whom the Demiurge and the material cosmos that it creates are both inherently evil because of the nature of matter. But unlike for Plato, for whom the Demiurge is fundamentally wise and a benevolent deity, the Valentinian Demiurge is basically an ignorant instrument of the cunning of Sophia. That is, until the Demiurge becomes central to the process of salvation and is itself redeemed as much as that is possible in that very process. Recall that the point of creation was to create a kind of theater of salvation for the salvation of the spiritual seed. And thus creation is fundamentally not a kind of material prison. It's what has to be created for salvation to happen at all. And after the Demiurge and the angels create the material and psychic human being, the spiritual seed is implanted into that primordial human. Thus the human being is capable of damnation via our material condition. We are capable of what we might call minor salvation via our psychic nature, and full salvation via the spiritual seed planted within us. But as the human being composed of body, mind, and spirit come to life, the Demiurge and his angels are awed. They're shocked. They're suddenly aware of the beauty and reality of the spiritual nature. But the mystery of the spiritual nature must wait. With the emanation of the left from the anguish of Sophia Achamout, we learn that, well, evil has entered the chat in the form of Satan and his rampaging demons. These demons can attack both our bodies and our souls, our psyche, driving people into perdition through sinful debauchery. But in a desperate desire to actually save human beings, the Demiurge introduces the Mosaic law as a means for people to avoid the temptations of Satan and his demons. But in order to induce obedience to the law, to get people to actually follow the rules, the punishment of death is enacted, and the Demiurge inadvertently introduces at least physical death into the cosmos. Thus, for the Valentinians, the Torah was actually a desperate attempt by the Demiurge to introduce a system of legislation backed by the death penalty, such that the human beings would avoid the greater psychic death brought on by Satan and his demonic minions. But the law was ultimately insufficient for human beings to fully save themselves, especially to achieve complete spiritual salvation. Note how Valentinus takes a moderated position on the question of the rules of the Torah, compared both to the Sethian teacher and to Marcion. He's somewhere in between Sethianism and Marcionism and the Proto-Orthodoxy. And thus, just as he had done for Sophia Achemot, Christ descends from the Pleroma to the material cosmos to teach the full secret of salvation to the spiritual seed. In fact, the term spiritual seed seems to have been how the Valentinians refer to themselves as a community of faith. And at the baptism of Jesus, when Christ is fully revealed, the Demiurge is the first to take notice. Indeed, the Demiurge realizes his inferiority to the Christ, and thus the logical necessity of there being a superior reality to him. And having undergone this process of maturation, Sophia Achemot then teaches the truth about reality to the Demiurge, thus allowing it, to transform the eighth heaven into a kind of psychical paradise. While not as pure as the spiritual realm of the Pleroma, it does allow a form of redemption for both the Demiurge, but also those human beings who, failing the fullness of spiritual redemption, do achieve at least a kind of psychic redemption via the Mosaic law or philosophy. Philosophy can also save you in this system as well. Armed with this form of minor gnosis, we might say, the Demiurge pledges to continue to combat the forces of Satan until the time of the final redemption of the spiritual seed. With that spiritual redemption complete, the material cosmos will basically no longer be required for salvation, and thus it will be destroyed ultimately by fire. A bit of a stoicism into the world here, and this would ultimately destroy Satan and all his minions as well. In the final end, the Demiurge will retire to his psychic paradise in the eighth heaven, just below the spiritual Pleroma, along with those human beings who have achieved a similar psychic, though not spiritual, salvation, thus bringing the Valentinian soteriological drama to its, frankly, pretty epic conclusion. As you can see, especially if you've been watching this series on the Demiurge, the Valentinian conception is dramatically different from that of either Marcion or the Sethian teacher, but also pretty different from those of the Proto-Catholics, bearing a much more Platonic sensibility. It also gives the lie to the conception that the notion of a malevolent, demonic demiurge is at the heart of Gnosticism as such. That's just not Valentinus' position. The position of Valentinus is much more optimistic, even monistic as opposed to dualistic. While the Valentinian demiurge begins in a state of ignorance necessitated by its psychical rather than spiritual nature, even the demiurge is capable of some form of gnosis, and thus salvation. Indeed, the demiurge's creation of the cosmos is necessary for the salvation for the spiritual seed, and thus the demiurge acts as a kind of custodian and protector of the spiritual seed in its ongoing war with Satan. Thus, far from being evil, the Valentinian demiurge is something like a gentle giant, almost a bit like a cosmic golem, a far cry from the rapacious Yaldabaoth and his vile prison warden archons. And this more benevolent notion of the demiurge points us in the direction for the next episode in this series, the Hermetic Demiurge. Itself a manifestation of the divine will and reason responsible for the production of the realm of sensation, and often identified with the divine Son. But in the meantime, if you want to really dive into the teachings of Valentinianism, one of the best anthologies you can pick up is by Jeffrey S. Smith, and the major monograph on the Valentinians is by Einar Thomason called The Spiritual Seed, an excellent textbook published, you know it, by Brill. New discoveries continue to be made, including that the text on self-control, originally attributed to Basil of Caesarea, was actually composed by Valentinus himself. Finally, let me really recommend the works and classes of my friend and colleague M. David Litwa. Without any doubt in my mind, Litwa is the best resource online and in print for deep, reliable knowledge on topics in Gnosticism. If you want good information on Gnosticism, take a look at his books, take one of his classes. All of these can be found in the links below. But more Demiurge topics to come. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.